Good evening, this is eNCA Moneyline, your money guide. My name is Sikim Kabaderi. Coming up on the show tonight. R1 billion is needed to develop the country's coal resources. Don't get your hopes up, no food price drops anytime soon. And we ask, are you able to claim from your insurance for appliances that get damaged as a result of a power surge? But first, your top stories. South Africa's coal industry needs to dig up money for survival. Mining Minister Ngwako Ramatlhodi says about R100 billion is needed to develop the country's coal resources. The minister says the slow decline in commodity prices is weighing on the mineral. He believes price volatility has cost Africa's most advanced economy billions in revenue. The news comes after mining giant Glencore announced that it was considering shutting down some of its coal mines. The company also blames the slump in commodity prices for the lack of efficiency in the industry. The closure of mines is set to affect over 1,000 jobs. Business conditions are taking a knock due to unstable power supply. The latest HSBC Purchasing Managers Index shows a drop in January. The index fell to 49.8 last month from 50.2 in December. This marks the first drop in the index since July last year. Eskom's recent load shedding has dampened sentiment. The HSBC PMI measures operating conditions in the private sector, and a reading below 50 signals deterioration. What's also emerged is that companies did not hire additional staff in January due to a decline in output and new orders for a second consecutive month. Data revenue is becoming a big part of Vodacom's business with every passing quarter. The telecoms company says its data sales rose 20% to 4.3 billion rand. This is more than the 27% of total revenue received. The number of active data users was also on the up. 26.5 million people now use Vodacom's data services. Total revenue for the last quarter of 2014 dropped just over 1% to nearly 20 billion rand. Vodacom is South Africa's largest mobile telecommunications provider with 61.1 million users across Africa. Vodacom is set to buy fixed-line operator Neotel for 7 billion rand, but is awaiting a competition ruling from NERSA. The company traded nearly 2% lower to finish at 132 rand. Fuel prices dropped sharply today, bringing relief to cash-strapped motorists and businesses. Many of us are hoping that the lower petrol price will have a knock-on effect. Food prices have dropped slightly since the petrol price started decreasing last year, but at least one economist says we shouldn't get our hopes up for big savings on our monthly shop.
Fuel prices have gone down and motorists are smiling all the way to the pumps. The price of petrol now costs just over 10 rand. The last time we saw this price was in 2011.
But while it may be cheaper to get around, it doesn't mean groceries are less expensive. Stats SA reported a drop in food inflation last year. But an NGO tracking the cost of various foods for several months says the decline in fuel price hasn't filtered down as it should have. The Pietermaritzburg Agency for Community Social Action monitors a basket of goods like maize meal, sugar, bread and milk.
This basket of 32 products cost in October 1,557 rand. In November, it dropped to 1,550 rand. So you can see it was a 7 rand drop, which at the household level is basically insignificant.
Okay.
In December, this basket increased to 1,583 rand. And in January, the same basket dropped to 1,568 rand, a drop of 15 rand.
But with a 93 cents a litre drop in petrol price, surely there will be an impact on food prices. Not so, says economist Kevin Lings.
Unfortunately, for many companies in South Africa, they would argue that they've been facing higher costs over the last couple of months. They've seen electricity prices go up, they've seen labor costs go up, they've seen rents go up. And for many companies, they will argue that they need to recoup those costs.
Links says what may happen is that food prices will increase at a much slower rate. But with crude oil prices going up, it's uncertain whether the relief at the pumps will last. Malungelo Pui, Johannesburg.
Global oil prices have bounced back this week, gaining 7% and climbing to just over $56. Despite this, oil companies are still feeling the heat. BP is the latest to announce a hit on their profits due to softer oil prices.
Any rise in the oil price may be too little too late for companies like BP. Its underlying profit between October and December 2014 fell 20% from the same period the year before. This is forcing the company to slash spending on assets and investments by as much as $6 billion.
It's going to have to keep a lid on costs. It's going to have to be very forensic in terms of future capital expenditure, and it's going to have to get used to essentially a much lower average oil price over the next 18 months to 2 years.
BP's announcement comes after its rivals ExxonMobil and Shell said they would have to streamline their operations. This, they cautioned, would most likely lead to job losses.
I think this drop has been due to surplus of oil and gas, which is unusual because previous downturns have been a result of financial crises. But the reality is these operators have to be in the short term generating profits, and if the oil price is low, they have to react with cost reductions, even though everyone understands that oil and gas is a long-term play.
Varma Devan says the next 2 years will be challenging.
It is a balancing act between doing the right cost reductions to keep the investors happy over the short term, but not cutting so far back that you lose the best talent, so that when the industry does return, and the oil and gas industry has always shown that it does ultimately return to growth, that you don't then lack the skills to develop the field.
BP says it plans to postpone a number of projects in order to cut costs.
Now, according to the latest Global Terrorism Index produced by the Institute for Economics and Peace, South Africa ranked in the top 50 countries where terrorist activity took place. Africa is a hotbed for terrorist activity and organized crime due to high levels of corruption, lawlessness, ineffective law enforcement and lax border controls. Bernard Holt is head of business crime and forensics at Worksman's Attorneys and joins us now. Bernard, thanks for your time today. In fact, you held a briefing today just warning companies that may be unwittingly funding terrorism. Tell us a little bit about that.
It all arose when I watched the world leaders on their march in Paris. And I don't think many people weren't moved in some way, because it was the first time that I saw so many people banding together and saying, no, we can't allow this to happen. And I thought to myself, well, you've got different avenues. You've got the security forces that need to take control of that. But how is the funding happening? What can we do to say no? How can we do it? And I started looking into things, and all of a sudden you see alarming trends where there are unholy convenient alliances between traditional organized crime and terrorists. Ideologies differ, but they all need money. And you see this developing, and you see that organizations seem to be targeting jurisdictions where they perceive there to be lawlessness, corruption, inefficient law enforcement authorities. Okay. And that's where they target.
So what is the modus operandi then? How do they gain the funds illicitly?
You've got various ways of doing it. You've got from revenue generating activities to charities. So you've got charities that have been set up, NGOs that have been set up, and they've been reported on in the press quite a few years ago. There were some charities set up in South Africa ostensibly to collect money for orphans, and when you looked into these organizations, you found that the orphans did not exist. So you've got charitable organizations, and then you've got revenue generating. And revenue generating takes different forms. So we can't necessarily say this is funding terror because of the amalgamation between organized crime and terror.
Okay.
So, for instance, you've got cyber criminals, you've got Eastern European syndicates who are targeting. Last year we heard how they decimated JP Morgan.
Yeah.
They're here in South Africa. There have been companies who've had their databases taken captive, and now they're demanding ransoms. So you go from there to companies setting up business with this veneer of legitimacy and wishing to contract with companies that have reputations and integrity in the business sphere here. The problem is the companies with whom they're contracting is, are they really doing the appropriate due diligence to understand who they're contracting with?
Okay.
So there are various ways which are disturbing.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about that due diligence. I mean, how would it work? What should companies be doing practically to make sure that they know exactly who they're doing business with and where those funds may end up?
Firstly, we must remember we've got legislation in place. We've got very good legislation in place. Problem is the enforcement of the legislation. So if you take one piece of legislation, FICA, Financial Intelligence Center Act, it says accountable institutions, and a lot of organizations are defined as accountable institutions: banks, attorneys, stockbroking firms. They have an obligation to know your client. Now, what does know your client mean? Do you tick a box? Do you say, can I have your identity document? Can I see your company, your official company documentation? On the face, it looks all good, but we know in 2010 the Department of Trade and Industry had to institute a massive forensic investigation because there were frauds going on with the Pakistani syndicates in the Companies Office. We also know about the corruption in the Department of Home Affairs and the problem with legitimate South African passports being abused.
Yes.
So it's not a simple way of just ticking a box. It's about applying, increasing your level of knowledge and applying greater scrutiny to people and organizations with whom you are interacting.
Okay, so don't just do the basics, actually do an in-depth investigation. Yes. All right, Bernard, we'll leave it there. Bernard Holt is Head of Business Crime and Forensics at Worksman's Attorneys. And after the break, we ask, are you able to claim from your insurance for appliances that get damaged as a result of a power surge? You're watching eNCA Moneyline, your money guide. Stay with us.